Hello and welcome to the e-lecture looking at ideas of postmodernity. We're going to recap on definitions of postmodernism, think about postmodernity and the relationship between the two, and what the experience of that might be, so how we might term the postmodern condition. This work builds on what we looked at in relation to modernity. So we thought about society, we thought about modernity as being a historical epoch, a period of potential advancement, certainly a period of crisis, certainly a period of change. We talked about a changing demographic, people moving from the country, moving to the city, and all those kind of feelings of alienation and fragmentation, and how that was then reflected in the art of the time, in the culture of the time. So thinking about modernism as being a response to context, a response to society and societal changes. Well, in some ways we move the discussion on. So we start to think, like we did about postmodernism, what that term post might mean. Does postmodernity means that modernity itself has come to an end, that we're seeing something different, that society is being changed? And one of the points that we talked about in the lecture was the possibility of that change happening after the Second World War. And I'll recap for you why that might be. One of the things that I want you to have in mind, though, is the ways in which postmodernism and postmodernity might be seen to have become collapsed. So some of the barriers, some of the differences that we identified between modernity and modernism may be different for postmodernity and postmodernism. I'm going to talk to you specifically about why that would be, and which critics in particular, if you're interested in this, that you can seek out and get more information about. So has modernity come to a close? Is it over and done with? Or in some ways, is this a change? Is this modernity changing? And that might be something for you to consider, certainly thinking about the exam in relation to ideas of the postmodern in particular. There are different ways of approaching postmodernity, different ways of thinking about it, and we might think about it in relation to difference. So one of the key critics that we'll talk about, Jean-Francois Lyotard, is important in this respect. And we can think about the ways in which interpretation then, through postmodernism, gives us this sense that there is no essential truth, that ideas of interpretation are relative and subjective, and those are ideas that we've come across before as well, so they shouldn't be too new for you. So an overview of what we're going to talk about today. Like I said, we're going to figure out the kind of the connections between the postmodernity and postmodern condition, but we're going to do that through three important theorists, and these are theorists who are talking about culture as well as literature and also about society. So Jean-Francois Lyotard, very important French critic, Jean Baudrillard, and also Frederick Jameson. And Jameson was somebody that we picked out in the lecture, as was Lyotard, and we're going to start to build really on some of those ideas. So it may help you to go back. You may want to listen to this lecture and then go back to some of the ideas, some of the notes that you made in relation to postmodernism, so ideas of the arts. And I introduced you to three critical ideas, three critical terms: historiographic metafiction, which was Linda Hutchinson's term, intertextuality, and we looked at definitions of that in relation to Christeva and Graham Allen as well, and also the process of deconstruction, so the process by which we take a text apart and show it as it cannot know itself. So those Terry Eagleton ideas in particular, but those concepts come from Jacques Derrida. So if you're interested in that, that would be somebody to go back to. I quite like my little frame here, talking about ideas of copying. There's a lovely clip, if you've ever seen Fight Club, the film of Fight Club, where one of the characters, Tyler Durden, is at the photocopier, and is a sense at which nothing is original, everything is copied, and he's standing at the photocopier and kind of bemoaning his postmodern existence. So this is an opportunity to watch a couple of good films. Going to talk a little bit maybe about Fight Club later on, but also The Matrix as well, and ideas of kind of copying and cloning, which can be seen in the literature of the time as well, and also in how the human condition, how we talk about ourselves, and how we think about our relationship to the world as well. So some terms for you then. Postmodernism, thinking about the relationship between the modern. To what extent have we gone beyond the modern? And Daniel Foster's work on this in relation to this notion perhaps of the post-industrial age, is that something that we are advancing? Some of the work that I'm interested in, and my other colleagues, in particular Alice Bell and Alison Gibbons, thinking about digital forms and how we might be post-human. So if you're interested in that, thinking about Donna Haraway and the Cyborg Manifesto, particularly important from the 1990s, and ways in which that got us to rethink about our relationship to information, our relationship to media as well. So this is a little still here from a recent film, Gone Girl, which you may have seen or may have read, thinking about ideas and manufacturing ideas of identity and how we can manufacture stories, truths, interpretations through the media as well. So we raised a lot of questions. We raised a lot of questions when we started to talk about postmodernism. What is that? What is that as a concept? Is it a concept? Is it a practice? In what ways might we see it now as being more of a kind of a style, perhaps? A style that reflects a particular economic, particular historical epoch or age. And actually, some of those considerations have become more relevant more recently. So as we move through what might be termed postmodernism, as we get to the other side of the millennium, the other side of the century, we are in a 21st century, an interconnected age. In what ways is the postmodern actually less of an important term? So for those of you who are interested in what happens next beyond postmodernism, looking at something like The Death of Theory, looking at Stephen Connor's work, looking at Jonathan Culler's work as well would be really, really useful to you. But for now, I want to keep our attention on postmodernity. Postmodernity and the kind of experience of the postmodern reflects what's termed as the society of the spectacle. We talked about modernity and the features of global connectivity and mass media. That has become so much more important post-war. Ideas of capitalisation and capital being cross-global, being multinational, being huge. If you think about Google, if you think about Amazon, think about this kind of connectedness of a media society and the way in which we consume knowledge. Lyotard, who we'll talk about later on, talks about this idea of being a particular postmodern idea, that the logic of late capitalism, we get knowledge that becomes a commodity. It is an exchange product, something that is bought and sold and exchanged. And that's a key idea in relation to ideas of the postmodern. So here we are, thinking about society of the spectacle. Where has this come from? Has this come from a rejection of modernity? Is it a rejection of progress? And we talked about a line, if not a direct line, from the Enlightenment, thinking about ideas of rationality and progression and technological advancement, ideas of psychoanalysts and the mind, ideas of testing and losing faith, maybe a kind of a notion of the agnostic as well. So where does the postmodern come from? You know, is it a continuation, a reflection on those concerns? Is it born out of horror and pessimism? There's a useful book, The End of Modernity, Fatimo, talking about the postmodern condition being born out of nihilism, being born out of this kind of idea of horror and pessimism. I tend to position postmodernity a slightly different way, but it may be that you want to engage with those ideas and think about those ideas in particular. So I'm interested, I suppose, a little bit more in ideas of relativity, so interpretation and difference and repositioning ourselves in this society. To what extent are the effects of World War II, the atomic bomb, the Cold War affecting our sense of faith in one another and ideas of the human as well? So this is quite a long quote, quoted in a book by David Harvey, which I think is really important, and it's one that I paraphrased to you when we talked about postmodernism. So it's talking, I think, in a useful gloss, reconnecting with Horkheimer and Adorno, those Frankfurt School critics that we talked about, thinking about then the dialectic of the Enlightenment, the logic of progress, the logic of Enlightenment thinking, what they term the Enlightenment project in particular, and drawing our attention to this use of technology, how technology has been used. There's a production on at the moment at the Crucible, which you may want to get along to, Playing for Time, which uses this idea of human nature in Auschwitz in particular. So if you have the opportunity to go and see that, it may help some of your thinking about how technology is being used to solve a problem of humanity in this instance. So it's a very problematic logic, which is what these theorists are kind of getting at. So I just pause for a minute there. I'm aware that we're kind of rushing through some of these concepts, but you may want to just pause and take a moment to think about this idea of oppression coming out perhaps of a philosophical good, but resulting in this kind of a nightmare condition of self-domination. So you can see how ideas of nihilism would fit with this idea, and how that might then be reflected in some of the work that we look at. The relationship between postmodernity and postmodernism is an important one, and I think that Eagleton, as a critic, is quite a useful critic, quite a useful way in. He talks, I think, very clearly about literary theory and also about postmodernism. So do use his work to think about these ideas. He talks about these terms as being generally used in reference, and I think that's important because it's not exclusive. But postmodernism, in effect, is thinking about culture, it's thinking about the arts, whereas the term postmodernity tends to think about a particular historical period, and is typified by a particular type of thought. This notion, this idea of being suspicious of some of these master narratives that we talked about, to use Lyotard's term. So suspicious of ideas of truth, ideas of philosophy, perhaps of literature, of reason, that there's no ground that we can step back, no framework that we can step back and look at human progress and think of it in terms of a kind of an explanation. So we talked about Lyotard's terms last week. We talked about truth as being located within the little narrative, the little story, rather than these sweeping master narratives and stories. So the way in which literature reflects this, it reflects this change, it reflects our feeling and our experience of postmodernity. And what we tend to find is this Jameson notion of depthlessness. We are decentered. We talked about the ways in which some of those texts use marginal characters to rethink our appreciation of a particular story or a particular era. So go back, look at what I said in relation to The Tempest and A Tempest. Look at the relationship between Jane Eyre and Wide Sargasso Sea. What we tend to find in postmodern literature, which I particularly enjoy, is a playfulness that actually I don't see and don't tend to find in modernist work in particular. It's derivative work, it's very eclectic, it's very intertextual, and you've found that in relation to Stoppard's work in particular. I'll pause there. That's the end of this first recording, and I'll upload the second for you.